There is a room that only one man may enter, not just any man, the high priest, and only once a year, nobody else, ever. And now a Roman is standing in it, in blood-stained boots, with a sword at his hip. He looks around and waits to finally lay eyes on the god this strange people has been hiding from the world so jealously. There is nothing, no statue, no altar, an empty room. The man who has just tracked mud into another nation's holiest place is called Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. He swept the pirates out of the entire Mediterranean. He has seen the temples of Egypt. He has seen Persian gold. He has seen everything the East had to show him. And now he stands in the heart of the temple in Jerusalem and does not understand what he is looking at. Tacitus, the Roman historian writing about this generations later, brushes it off in a single line. There was no image of any god inside. The place stood empty. The sanctuary held nothing. Josephus, and I'll have plenty to say about him, because without him there would be no episode, adds that Pompey saw a table, a lampstand, sacrificial vessels, and money, some 2,000 talents in the treasury. And he touched none of it. Out of piety, Josephus writes. Well, maybe. Or maybe Pompey was simply shrewd enough to know that robbing another man's god is a poor investment over the long run. This is the second episode about the beginnings of Palestine and about why the kingdoms of Israel disappeared. You don't need the first one to follow this one, but if you want to see what came before, I recommend it. I plan to wrap the subject up here, but it's a rich one, full of reversals, and it isn't worth telling in shorthand. I'm planning 3 episodes. And tell me in the comments why you think the Jews survived, while the rest of the tribes dissolved into the dark. But back to the empty room, because everything starts there. That summer, 63 BCE, Rome walks into Judea and never walks out again, for the next 700 years. How did Pompey end up there at all? Well, that's the thing. He didn't hack his way in like some invader from a storybook. He was invited. 2 brothers from the Jewish dynasty were fighting over the throne, and both of them, independently, ran to the Roman to settle the dispute in their favour. 2 brothers argued over the house so bitterly that they both called the police, and then the police moved in permanently and stayed for 7 centuries. That's roughly how it went. One brother is Hyrcanus, the other Aristobulus. Who they are, I'll explain in a moment, because their whole family could carry its own series. For now, this much. 2 men wanted to beat each other so badly that they handed their own country to a foreign power. Pompey picked the weaker one, Hyrcanus. Why the weaker one? Because a weak ruler is a convenient ruler. A weak man does as he's told. And then the Roman took out a map and started cutting. In a matter of weeks he takes the region apart. The coastal cities severed, Samaria severed, the lands across the Jordan severed, Galilee in the north separated out, all of it lifted from the authority of Jewish kings and glued onto the Roman province of Syria, or declared free cities. Judea, a substantial state a year earlier, shrinks to a stump around Jerusalem itself. Add the tribute imposed after the conquest, a levy that bled the local economy for generations, a garrison to feed, and that weak Hyrcanus on the throne, no longer as king. Rome stripped him of that title, but as ethnarch. An ethnarch is roughly a leader of a people, in practice, a religious administrator and tax collector on Rome's payroll. And here's the thing that gets lost in the standard version. We look back from a distance and see a conqueror destroying. Rome walks in, tramples, robs. We file it under tragedy. Except that at that same moment, 70 odd kilometres to the west, people in Gaza are raising toasts. In Gadara, in Scythopolis, in Hippos, in the Greek cities that Jewish kings had conquered by force a generation earlier, whose temples they had levelled, whose inhabitants they had slaughtered or driven out. This is the best day in decades. From where they stand, the Roman is not an invader. He is a liberator. Pompey even orders Gadara rebuilt, the city the Jews had flattened. For those cities, the conquest was such a turning point that they started a new calendar, the Pompeian era, with the Jewish past thrown overboard. The spine of this episode is simple, so I'll lay it out right now, up front, so it lands. This is a region where 12 peoples live at once. Jews, Samaritans, Greeks, Idumeans, Nabateans, Itureans, Phoenicians, Syrians. And every one of them hates the rest. Every one has its own version, and in every one of those versions, that particular group is the victim, and everyone else is the executioner. This is not a story about good guys and bad guys. This is a story about 12 groups of people spending 2 centuries doing unforgivable things to each other, and then Rome arrives and does it to all of them at once. Into this chaos steps a man who smells an opportunity, an Idumean, from a family whose ancestors were converted to Judaism at sword point. His name is Antipater, and his family is about to take over the entire country. Before I get to him, I'm going to step back. I want to show you what was left behind by the men Pompey has just knocked off the board, because without that, you won't understand why the Greek cities were celebrating, and why, when somebody tells me the Jews in this region were always and only persecuted, I answer, hold on, that depends which century we're talking about. The dynasty ruling Judea before Rome was called the Hasmoneans. I covered them in the previous episode, so I'll just recap. They started as heroes, genuinely, a handful of priests from the Maccabee family who rose against a Greek king forcing foreign gods on them, won against every odd and took back their independence. A beautiful story. It would make a good film. And then the thing happened that always happens to heroes who get their hands on power. They started conquering. The first one I'll introduce properly, John Hyrcanus I, and I'm warning you now, because you're about to get lost, and I'll get lost with you. This is a different Hyrcanus from the weak one at the start. He's the grandfather of that one. Yes. In this family, almost everyone had the same name. Several Hyrcanuses, several Aristobuluses, and whoever tells the story goes grey. Bear with me. John Hyrcanus I ruled Judea in the closing years of the 2nd century BCE and decided the borders of his state were far too tight. He marched south into Idumea, the country out where the Negev desert is today. He took it. And then he did something that for its time was absolutely unheard of. He forced the entire conquered nation to be circumcised, meaning to convert to Judaism, under threat of death. Not convert if you feel like it, rather convert or die. An entire people. Overnight the Idumeans became Jews, whether they wanted it or not. Hold on to that detail, it comes back shortly, because out of those forcibly converted Idumeans will come the most powerful family in this whole story. Then John Hyrcanus went north to Samaria, and here I'm going to stop, because this is the most important scene in the chapter. Who are the Samaritans? Because they're not pagans? They're not foreigners? The Samaritans are cousins of the Jews, close ones. They worship the same God. They have the same Torah, the same 5 books of Moses, near enough word for word identical. They have their own priesthood, their own rituals, their own sanctuary. The whole difference comes down, essentially, to an address. The Jews say, God chose Jerusalem. The Samaritans say, God chose Mount Gerizim in the north. That's it. That's the entire quarrel. Two groups worshipping the same God, arguing about where he lives. And John Hyrcanus settled that quarrel. He came to Gerizim and razed the Samaritan temple to the ground. Not the Romans, not the Greeks, no invader from outside. Jews destroyed the temple of people who prayed to the same God they did, just somewhere else. For the Samaritans, this is their burning of the temple, their catastrophe, the one everything else is measured from. And this is where it gets cold for me, because they remember it, and I mean that literally, to this day. The Samaritans didn't die out. There are around 900 of them left in the world by a fairly recent census, and they live in two places, some in Cholon in Israel, some in the village of Kiryat Luza on the slope of that same Mount Gerizim, and every year they sacrifice a lamb there. They have their own high priest, somewhere past the 100th in an unbroken line. 2,500 years after John Hyrcanus levelled their temple, they still haven't let it go. This isn't a grudge. This is an identity built around a single injury, carried by 100 generations. The next Hasmonean, Hyrcanus' son, Aristobulus I, he ruled briefly, but he found time to push further north and conquer Ituraea, a land in what's now Lebanon. And he repeated his father's trick exactly. Forced conversion. A second entire nation converted by force within 2 generations. And honestly, it's starting to blur for me a little, because the pattern is the same every time. Marched, conquered, converted. A priestly dynasty, born out of a rebellion for religious freedom, forcibly converted 3 nations in a single generation and destroyed its cousin's temple. Alright, except the third one in this series is worse than the ones before him. Alexander Jannaeus, husband of Aristobulus' widow, the next king of this increasingly unhinged dynasty. This one didn't bother with conversions. This one simply took and destroyed. When he was serving as high priest during Sukkot, the autumn festival when Jews build booths to remember the wandering in the desert, he was supposed to pour water on the altar according to the Pharisaic rite. Jannaeus poured it over his own feet, in front of the crowd, and the crowd answered with what it had to hand, which was citrons. For those citrons, Jannaeus called in mercenaries and had 6,000 people slaughtered in the temple courtyard. 6,000 for throwing fruit. Then he went after the Greek cities, Gadara, Pella, Gerasa, took them and flattened them. Gadara so thoroughly that Pompey would later rebuild it from the foundations. And Gaza he treated worst of all. After a year-long siege, Gaza capitulated. An agreement, terms, his word on it. Jannaeus broke his word. Josephus writes that he butchered the inhabitants despite the surrender. And he is the man at the centre of the scene I mentioned in the last episode. 800 Pharisees crucified all at once, their wives and children cut down before their dying eyes, while Jannaeus feasts with his mistresses. You know that one. But in the previous episode, I didn't tell you the rest. After that execution, some 8,000 of Jannaeus' opponents fled Judea, and the whole internal war, Pharisees against Jannaeus, dragged on for 6 years, and according to Josephus, cost 50,000 Jewish lives. 50,000, and not in a war against a foreign invader. Jews were killing Jews. And during that war, the Pharisees brought in a foreign king, Demetrius III, to defeat their own ruler. The same maneuver the Hellenizers had pulled earlier with Antiochus, only mirrored. This time, it's the pious inviting the pagan king. Let's add it up. The Hasmoneans were not defending themselves. The Hasmoneans were conquering. They were building an empire whose main instrument was forced conversion and massacre. From the point of view of a Greek in Gadara, a Samaritan at Gerizim, an Idumean, an Iturean, the Jews were the aggressor. It was the Jews who came with a sword and said, "Your God is ours now. Your temple is rubble. You have a week to get circumcised." So when somebody tells me the Jews in this region were always the victim, I answer, in many eras they were, many times over, terribly. But the Hasmoneans were not the victim. The Hasmoneans persecuted. And the Greek cities toasting Pompey's arrival had their reasons. This is the world Rome walks into. A world where everyone has already done something to somebody. Back to the Idumean. Back to Antipater. Remember who the Idumeans are? The nation John Hyrcanus converted by force a generation earlier. Which means Antipater is a Jew, but a second-hand Jew. A Jew by coercion, by conquest. In the eyes of the real Jerusalem aristocracy, he's a half-outsider, an upstart, a nobody. And this nobody will turn out to be cleverer than all of them combined. Antipater was an advisor to the weak Hyrcanus, the ethnarch Rome had installed, and he understood one simple thing very quickly. If Rome runs this place, there's no point fighting Rome. You have to make yourself useful to Rome. The opportunity came in Egypt. Julius Caesar, that Caesar, the famous one, was stuck in Alexandria, surrounded, in serious trouble. Antipater brought him reinforcements at the decisive moment. Caesar didn't forget. He gave Antipater Roman citizenship and the office of administrator of Judea, and he handed out posts to Antipater's sons. One of them got Galilee. That son was named Herod. And Herod showed from the first moment who he was going to be. Galilee was crawling with men the Romans called bandits, and who probably called themselves something else. Fighters, partisans, who knows? Their leader was Hezekiah. Herod caught him and killed him. No court, no trial. He simply removed him and his men. And here's the snag, because that was illegal. Judea had the Sanhedrin for exactly this sort of thing. The Supreme Jewish Council, court and parliament in one, the body that decided life and death under Jewish law. The Sanhedrin summoned Herod to trial. You killed men without a verdict, stand before the court. Herod came. Yes, he came to the trial, except he came with his guard. He walked into the chamber, surrounded by armed soldiers, dressed in purple, and looked at the judges in a way that stopped every one of them from making a sound. The judge watched the defendant bring his own army to the hearing, and now had to decide whether he still wanted to play at being a judge. The trial dissolved. Nobody convicted anyone. It was the lesson Herod taught his entire life. The law is for people who are short of soldiers. And then everything collapsed, because the Parthians walked onto the stage. The Parthians are an empire east of Rome, roughly where Iran is today. The one empire Rome could not beat for centuries. The only one. The Romans conquered nearly the whole known world and kept banging their heads against the Parthians, over and over. And it was the Parthians who, using the mess in Rome after Caesar's murder and the chaos in Judea, walked into Jerusalem. They put their own candidate on the throne, another Hasmonean, a man named Antigonus. And with the weak Hyrcanus they did something cruel and calculated. Antigonus bit off his ears with his own teeth. Why the ears? Because Jewish law said only a man without blemish on his body could be high priest. A mutilated Hyrcanus could never hold the office again. With one bite, Antigonus removed him from the game forever. Not by taking his life, but by taking the thing that made him anyone at all. Herod didn't wait. He packed up his family, moved them out to a fortress in the desert, to Masada, which I'll come back to at length, left his people there under guard, and sailed for Rome himself. Because he understood that his future wasn't in Jerusalem, it was in the capital of the empire. And in Rome, a scene played out so absurd that if it weren't true, nobody would believe it. The Senate granted Herod the title of King of the Jews, and the ceremony was held in the temple of Jupiter. A Jewish king crowned in a pagan temple, in honor of a pagan god his own people considered an idol. And you know the best part? It probably didn't bother Herod in the slightest. He walked out of that temple with a crown on his head, flanked by the two most powerful Romans of the age, and I'm willing to bet the only thing on his mind was where he was going to find an army. A crown is a crown. Where it comes from doesn't matter. There was only one catch. Herod was king of the Jews, but he didn't hold a scrap of a kingdom. Jerusalem was held by Antigonus, backed by the Parthians. Herod had to take his own kingdom by force. It took him 3 years. 3 years of fighting and sieges, until finally, supported by the Roman legions of the general Sosius, he took Jerusalem. Antigonus, the last king of the Hasmonean dynasty, was captured by the Romans, and they did something to him they had never done to any king. First they flogged him, tied to a stake, then beheaded him. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, writes that this was the first time in history the Romans inflicted such a punishment on a king. Plutarch records the beheading itself, and at the end they mockingly called him Antigone, after the heroine of the Greek tragedy, a woman. So the last Jewish king of the heroic Maccabee line left this world flogged, beheaded, and laughed at as a girl. Humiliation planned down to the smallest detail. And onto the throne sat the son of a forcibly converted Idumean, a man the real Jewish aristocracy never once accepted as their own, Herod the Great. His 40 years begin. To understand Herod, you have to grasp one thing that most tellings skip. Herod wasn't building for the Jews. Herod was building for anyone who could keep him in power, and that's where his tragedy sits. The genius is in there too, just hidden behind the bodies. Let's start with a city that shouldn't exist at all. On the coast, where a run-down Phoenician settlement called Stratos Tower once stood, Herod decided to build a port. The problem was that there was no natural bay there. No shelter, no headland, nothing. Open sea slamming straight into the shore. Any sensible engineer would have said, "It can't be done." Herod said, "We're building." And he built an artificial harbour. From nothing. The largest artificial harbour in the entire Mediterranean. How? Thanks to a Roman invention that to people of that era must have looked like black magic. Concrete that hardens underwater. It was called pozzolanic concrete, but the name doesn't matter here. What matters is that it's set underwater, thanks to volcanic ash from near Naples. Herod imported tens of thousands of cubic meters of that ash, thousands of tons of it, from across the sea, and his engineers lowered enormous wooden crates of concrete onto the seabed. Breakwaters where nature had given nothing. And now the part that floors me. Modern researchers pulled samples out of those breakwaters and found that this concrete doesn't weaken over the centuries, it strengthens. because seawater reacts with the minerals inside it. That's why Herod's breakwaters have lasted 2,000 years. Our concrete crumbles in salt water after a few decades. 2,000 years ago, they did it better than we do today. I hate admitting that, but there it is. He named the city Caesarea in honor of the emperor, the harbor Sebastos, which in Greek means exactly what Augustus means in Latin. And it was a thoroughly Greek and Roman city, a hippodrome for chariot races, a theatre still in use today, they hold concerts in it, an amphitheatre, and on the hill, visible from the sea to everyone sailing into the harbour, a temple of Augustus with colossal statues in white marble, a pagan temple in a city built by a Jewish king. And in that Caesarea, 2,000 years later, in that theatre, one day in 1961, an Italian team of archaeologists turned over some stones and came across a limestone slab, reused as building material somewhere in the steppes, treated for centuries as ordinary rubble, and on it, partly damaged but legible, a Latin inscription: Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. For the first time in history, somebody held in their hands physical proof that this man existed at all. Before that, we knew him only from texts, from the Gospels, from Josephus. And here, suddenly, a stone with his name on it, dumped into the rubble, lying for 2,000 years under the feet of people who had no idea what they were walking on. I'll come back to Pilate, because he's earned it. Onwards. Samaria. The same Samaria whose temple John Hyrcanus destroyed, Herod rebuilt. Except he didn't rebuild the Samaritan sanctuary, heaven forbid. He renamed the city Sebaste, again in honor of Augustus, and put up yet another pagan temple in it. On the ruins of an old Israelite sanctuary, a temple to a Roman emperor. From where the locals stood, it looked like this. First the Jews destroy your temple. Then a Jewish king puts a foreign emperor's temple on the site. The same hill, desecrated twice, by two different sides. Masada, the desert fortress Herod had moved his family to, became his private palace on a rock. A three-tiered palace carved into a cliff, hanging over the drop, with baths, with mosaics, with a cistern system holding 40,000 cubic meters of water in the middle of the desert. Dry wind, a cliff edge, silence for kilometers, in case he ever had to run. Herod spent his whole life planning an escape. Remember Masada. It comes back at the very end of this story, in a role Herod would never have imagined for it. And then, the biggest project of all, the temple in Jerusalem. Here, Herod played it differently. Here he wasn't building for the emperor. Here he was building for the Jews, to earn just once the love he never had from them, because to them he stayed forever, that Idumean, by coercion. He took the existing second temple and blew it up to a scale the region had never seen. He doubled the area of the Temple Mount, from some 7 hectares to over 14. He wrapped it in gigantic walls of blocks cut so precisely they held without mortar. The ordinary blocks weighed 2 to 5 tons, the corner ones 50 tons and up. And one of them, found in the tunnels under the city, is 13.5 meters long and weighs, by various estimates, anywhere from 250 tons to 500. One stone. How they dragged it there, nobody knows for certain, even now. That wall, its western section, still stands. It's called the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, the holiest site in modern Judaism. The detail that always floors me. The holiest wall in the Jewish world is a piece of masonry put up by a king the Jews couldn't stand while he was alive. A man who raised their temple with one hand and put up pagan temples to the emperor with the other. The temple building itself went up at lightning speed in 18 months because Herod had 1,000 priests trained as masons and carpenters, so lay workers wouldn't have to enter the holiest parts. But the whole thing, the courtyards, the porticos, the entire complex, dragged on for decades. The temple was declared finished barely 6 years or so before the Romans burned it. Sit with that for a moment. Generations of people worked on a building that stood in its full glory for a handful of years. A grandfather laid foundations for something his grandson would see completed a moment before it burned. What did it look like inside? Honestly, we don't fully know. Josephus describes it in fine detail. Except Josephus lies about so many things that with every description of his, I keep a hand on my wallet. I'll come back to why in chapter 4. The core of Herod is exactly here. He was building a Jewish temple and a pagan Caesarea at the same time, with the same money, by the same hands. Not out of tolerance, out of cold arithmetic. He needed the support of the Hellenistic elites and imperial Rome just as much as he needed quiet from the Jewish priesthood. He tried to satisfy everyone at once. And the result was what it always is when you try to satisfy everyone. He satisfied no one. The Greeks saw a Jew. The Jews saw a pagan and an Idumean. Rome saw a convenient client, but always a slightly suspect one. King of everyone, who belonged to no one. And now something that usually goes unsaid. Hold on, because Herod deserves more than the label of monster. The child killer of the story, the madman, the bloody tyrant. And yes, in a moment I'll show you that he wiped out half his own family. But before I do, let's stop at something that gets lost in all those monster stories. Herod was one of the most brilliant politicians of his era. Cold, sharp, ruthless. Look at this. Herod started as a client of Julius Caesar. Caesar was murdered. Cassius appeared, one of Caesar's assassins, and Herod immediately came to terms with Cassius. Cassius lost and died. Mark Antony appeared, and Herod attached himself to Antony loyally for years. And then Antony lost at Actium to Octavian, the future Augustus. It was like betting on a race where Herod backed the horse that would drop dead 2 laps later every single time and still walked off the track with winnings in his pocket. Because look what he pulled after Actium. Most of Antony's men were finished. They'd backed a loser. And Herod went to Rhodes to meet the victorious Octavian. He took the crown off his head to signal that he was demanding nothing, but he kept the rest of the royal trappings on. And he said something to Octavian that is a masterpiece. He didn't beg, he didn't grovel. He said, roughly, this: I was absolutely loyal to Antony to the very end. I sent him grain and money when he was already losing. And now look, I will be exactly that loyal to you. The question isn't whether I was faithful to Antony. The question is whether you want someone that faithful on your side. And Octavian, the future emperor of Rome, bought it. He gave Herod his crown back. Better than that, he enlarged his kingdom. 40 years. That's how long Herod balanced, between Rome and Parthia, between the Jewish aristocracy and the Hellenistic elites, between what the emperor wanted and what his own people refused to give him. 40 years on a wire over a chasm, and he never once fell. So I'll say it plainly. Herod is not a madman on a throne. He's a cold, brilliant player who happened to be a madman on occasion. And the order matters. Not a madman who was sometimes shrewd. A brilliant politician who was sometimes a monster. Alright, now the monster. because Herod's paranoia grew with every year, and when it struck his own family. The list is long. He killed a young high priest, his own wife's brother, because the boy was too popular, too loved by the people, so Herod had him drowned in a pool during a party, staged as an accident. Old Hyrcanus, the mutilated one, his father-in-law, went next. Mariamne, his wife, whom he supposedly genuinely loved, and whom he had killed in a fit of jealousy and suspicion. And then for years he walked the palace, calling her name, as if she was still alive. His mother-in-law, 2 sons, strangled at Sebaste on the basis of a rigged trial, and literally 5 days before his own death, he had one more removed, the eldest. And here antiquity left us the best punchline about Herod that exists. It hinged on the Jewish ban on eating pork. The Emperor Augustus, Octavian was Augustus by then, is supposed to have quipped, "Better to be Herod's pig than his son." In Greek it's a pun, because the word for pig and the word for son sound alike. And the meaning is cruel and exact. Herod, as a Jew, won't kill a pig, because he isn't allowed to eat it. But a son? A son he'll kill without blinking. In Herod's house, it was safer to be a pig than a child. And I'll be honest, 2,000 years later, that's still the best joke a Roman emperor ever made about anyone. His own death was gruesome. The sources describe a rotting body, gangrene, worms, a mind coming apart. He suffered for months. Some saw the hand of God in it. Doctors today try to put a name to it. Chronic kidney disease, maybe something worse. But the truth is, we don't know exactly what was eating him. We only know he died slowly and in agony. And yet, there's an uncomfortable thing that has to be said. Under Herod, Palestine had peace. 40 years of relative quiet. Greeks, Jews, Samaritans, Idumeans, all of them living under one roof. A brutal roof, built on fear and a network of fortresses, but a stable one. Herod was what this shredded, self-hating region needed in order not to fall apart. A strong, ruthless hand holding everyone by the throat at once, so nobody could go for anyone else's eyes. And that's why his death is such a turning point, because when Herod dies, the buffer disappears. The shock absorber between Rome and this cauldron of peoples disappears. And from that moment, everything starts sliding. Herod left a will. He split the kingdom between 3 sons. Archelaus got Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Antipas got Galilee and the lands across the Jordan, the same Antipas who would later behead John the Baptist. But not today. Philip got the territories in the northeast. None of them, not one, had their father's caliber. Philip, as it happens, ran his peace quietly for nearly 40 years and caused nobody any trouble. But he didn't dominate the story. Archelaus did, because he was hopeless. The worst turned out to be Archelaus, the one with the most important peace, with Judea and Jerusalem. He was so incompetent, so pointlessly brutal, so devoid of the instinct his father used to offset his cruelty, that something absolutely unheard of happened. A delegation went to Rome asking for his removal. A Jewish delegation, and a Samaritan delegation. Stop on that for a second. Jews and Samaritans, the same people who have hated each other for 2,500 years, who destroyed each other's temples, who will not sit at the same table. And here they are, travelling to Rome on the same errand, shoulder to shoulder, agreed as never before. Archelaus has to go. You have to be a spectacularly hopeless ruler to unite against you 2 nations that hadn't spoken to each other since before anybody can remember. That's an achievement. A negative one, but an achievement. Rome listened and recalled Archelaus, exiled him to Gaul, and Judea, the heart of the country, with Jerusalem, Rome took over directly. From then on, it was ruled by a Roman governor, a prefect. No more local king as a buffer. Now Rome sat right on your neck. For Rome, incidentally, Judea was a provincial nuisance. A small, poor, difficult province, costing more in garrisons than it returned in taxes. And the tension started showing everywhere. Most starkly in Caesarea, that magnificent city of Herod's, a mixed city where Greeks and Jews live side by side. Whose city is it? The Greeks said, ours. It's a Greek polis, with our theatre, our hippodrome, our laws. The Jews said, ours. A Jewish king built it. From the Greek point of view, the Jews wanted the same rights as the Greeks, but wouldn't eat with Greeks, didn't go to the Greek theatre, and had no intention of making offerings at Greek festivals. Which is a bit like wanting to vote in the elections of a country whose taxes you refuse to pay. The dispute dragged on for years until it reached the Emperor Nero himself, and Nero ruled in favour of the Greeks. That verdict comes back, because out of the sense among Caesarea's Jewish residents that Rome had sold them out, one of the first sparks of the Great Fire will fly. And you can see it in Caesarea plain as day. What's playing out here isn't a clash of two sides. A Greek beats a Jew beats a Samaritan, a Jew beats a Jew, an Idumean somewhere in between. And Rome in the middle of all of it, as an arbiter losing patience by the year, and who will eventually stop judging and start burning. Back to Pilate, because I promised. And I know what you're thinking, Pontius Pilate, that Pilate, the one from the trial, the washing of hands, the most famous verdict in history. Yes, the same man. But let me say straight away, that story is not this episode. Here I'm showing you a different Pilate, a Roman official who was a master of provocation, and who tested, over and over, how far you could push a conquered people before they snapped. First provocation, the standards. The Roman legions carried standards, and on them images of the emperor, busts. And here's the problem. Because Jewish law forbade making any images at all, and above all bringing them into the holy city. Earlier governors understood this, and entered Jerusalem using standards without those images, out of respect, or out of common sense. Pilate did it differently. He had the standards with the emperor's busts brought into Jerusalem, and he did it at night, quietly, without the people knowing. And that at night is everything here, because it gives away that Pilate knew exactly what he was doing. If he thought it was normal, he'd have brought them in by daylight, with trumpets. He brought them in under cover of darkness, like a man smuggling something forbidden. That wasn't a mistake, that was a test. In the morning the city woke up and saw images of the emperor on the holy hill, and a crowd set off, but not to fight. And that's the most beautiful thing in this story. The crowd set off for Caesarea, to Pilate's residence, and there the people simply lay down. They dropped to the ground around his house and lay there. Josephus writes, 5 days and 5 nights, no violence, no weapons, a prone crowd that would not move. On the 6th day, Pilate set a trap. He sat on his tribunal in the great stadium, feigning a willingness to talk. And when the crowd gathered, he gave a signal, and hidden soldiers surrounded them all in a triple cordon, weapons drawn. Pilate issued the ultimatum: accept the emperor's images, or die here and now. And then something happened that, as Josephus writes, completely broke the Roman script. The Jews, as if on a pre-arranged signal, all dropped to the ground at once and bared their necks, and they shouted that they would rather die than let their law be broken. Thousands of people offering their throats to the swords. Pilate, and this is from him too, was so taken aback by that religious stubbornness that he backed down. He ordered the standards carried back to Caesarea. He lost. An unarmed crowd beat an armed governor with nothing but a willingness to die. Except Pilate was learning. The second provocation was bloody. He decided to build an aqueduct to bring water to Jerusalem. Good in itself, the city needed water. The problem was where Pilate got the money. He reached into the temple treasury, into the fund called korbanos, and that was sacred money, given by Jews for the temple. Pilate took it, and again a crowd gathered. This time it didn't lie down quietly. This time people were shouting, abusing the governor. And Pilate, having learned something from the defeat over the standards, didn't march out openly with troops. He did something craftier. He had soldiers dressed in Jewish clothing, gave them clubs hidden under their robes, and sent them into the crowd. On a signal, those disguised soldiers started beating people with the clubs. Josephus writes that they struck harder than Pilate had ordered, making no distinction between the ones doing the shouting and the ones just standing there. Many died from the blows. Many were trampled in the panic. Those are the Romans. That's one side of this story. But, and this is the whole point of the chapter, it wasn't only Romans doing the provoking. Jewish radicals provoked too, and they did it to their own. First came the Sicarii. The name is from the Latin sica, a small curved dagger, and that tells you everything about their method. A Sicarius didn't fight in the field. A Sicarius stepped into a dense crowd during a festival, moved up behind his target, drove the dagger into the back or the belly, and then started shouting in horror himself, playing the innocent bystander, and vanished into the panic he had just created. Impossible to catch. And now the important part. Who were they killing? Not Romans. Above all, their own. Jews cooperating with Rome. Moderates. The ones who wanted to make a deal. This wasn't a liberation movement in any romantic sense. This was terror aimed at their own community. A dagger in a neighbour's back in the middle of a festival. There was also Menachem, the leader of the Sicarii, who at one point armed his men with weapons looted from Masada, and marched into Jerusalem like a king, in royal robes, effectively declaring himself the Messiah. And you know how he ended? It wasn't Romans who killed him. It was other Jewish rebels, whose path his arrogance had crossed. The uprising began eating its own children before it had properly caught fire. And there's a thing that may be the most interesting of all, because it shows this wasn't only a religious or a national conflict. It was a class war too. Because the Zealots, religious radicals convinced that the only ruler of the Jews is God, and no man has the right to govern, and I'll come back to them at the siege, burned the archives in Jerusalem, specifically the buildings where the debt records were kept, deeds of ownership, financial documents. They burned them with wood set aside for the altar. And that wasn't an accident or stupidity, it was a precision operation. Because when you burn the debt records, you erase overnight every obligation the poor owed the rich aristocracy. With one fire, the Zealots wiped out the debts of thousands of people and bought their fanatical loyalty. They turned a niche religious revolt into a mass social revolution, the poor against the rich, inside a single nation. And it blew. It started where it had to start, in Caesarea, in that mixed city where Nero had ruled for the Greeks. The spark was pathetically small. It was about a plot of land next to the main Jewish synagogue. A Greek owned the plot, and the Jews wanted to buy it from him to secure access to the synagogue. they offered many times its value. The Greek wouldn't sell. Worse, he started putting workshops on the plot, deliberately blocking the entrance. From his point of view, his plot, his right, his ground. From the Jewish side, deliberate provocation. And then came the Sabbath, the most important day of the Jewish week, the day of rest. And one of the local Greeks set a vessel down right in front of the synagogue entrance and began sacrificing birds, exactly where the Jews had to pass on their way to prayer. That was calculated blasphemy, a ritual defilement of a holy place in front of everyone, and the city exploded. Street fighting broke out. The Roman garrison, made up largely of local Syrians who couldn't stand Jews, didn't lift a finger to stop it. And then it got worse. Josephus writes of 20,000 Jews killed in the space of a single day. Even if that's inflated, and with Josephus almost everything is inflated, the scale of the slaughter was enormous. The city was cleared of them completely. And here the chain reaction begins, the darkest heart of this episode, because news of the massacre in Caesarea spread through the country and triggered Jewish reprisals. And those reprisals were every bit as brutal. Crowds of insurgents moved on the Greek and Syrian cities. Josephus names them: Philadelphia, which is present-day Amman in Jordan, Gerasa, Pella, Gadara, Hippos on the Sea of Galilee, and several more as far as Ashkelon in the south. In each of those cities they did exactly what the Greeks had done in Caesarea. They burned pagan temples, they looted houses, they killed the civilians who hadn't got out in time. Josephus gives it dryly, because it wasn't what interested him, but excavations at Gadara and Gerasa confirm destruction layers from this period. One exception: in Gerasa, the Greek residents not only spared their Jewish neighbours, they escorted those who wanted to leave safely to the city limits. One case of human decency across a dozen cities turned to ash. And in Damascus the Greeks answered with a massacre of their own. Over 10,000 Jews murdered in the gymnasium. The spiral had no bottom to it. But the worst happened in Scythopolis. It was a Greek city, the old Beth Shean, and it also had a sizable Jewish community. And when Jewish insurgents from outside moved on the area around Scythopolis, they expected the local Jews to back them, or at least stay neutral, their own people standing by their own. The opposite happened. The local Jews of Scythopolis took up arms on the Greek side, against their own. They picked up weapons and shoulder to shoulder with their Greek neighbours, drove off the advancing Jewish rebels. They chose the city, the home, the property, over blood. And here's the lesson that genuinely turns my stomach, because it repeats through history, over and over. Despite that bloody proof of loyalty, the Greeks of Scythopolis didn't trust their Jewish allies. They looked at them with suspicion. They were afraid the Jews would betray them in the night to buy back their guilt with the attacking countrymen. And so they set a trap. Under the pretext of safety, they ordered the entire Jewish population of the city, with their wives, with their children, to move into a grove outside the walls, for their protection, supposedly. The Jews obeyed, without resistance, because they wanted so badly to prove their loyalty that they stopped seeing the danger. For 2 days the Greeks did nothing. The grove stayed quiet, and the guard came down. And on the third night they surrounded the grove and killed every one of them. Over 13,000 people, the same people who a few days earlier had been killing their own brothers for them. And the property, naturally, they looted. And let's say it plainly, Jews burn Gadara and murder Greeks. Jews burn Hippos and Ashkelon. Greeks murder Jews in Caesarea. In Damascus, the Greeks butcher Jews in the gymnasium. Greeks murder the Jews who killed for them in Scythopolis. Jews murder Jews in Jerusalem. There is no clean side here. There are no innocents. There are a dozen groups of people, each of them simultaneously victim and executioner, depending on which year and which city you happen to be looking at. And the Sicarii, the men with the dagger in the crowd, have a sequel that destroys a certain myth. After their leader Menahem was killed, the remnants of the Sicarii fled south, back to the fortress above the Dead Sea, to Masada, the same Masada Herod had built as his escape palace. And here's the thing the patriotic tellings carefully leave out, because it ruins the whole picture. The Sicarii sat on Masada for 7 years, and in those 7 years, while the country burned, while Roman legions levelled Jewish settlements, while Jerusalem itself was besieged and bled, the Sicarii of Masada never once attacked the Romans. Not once. They shut themselves inside Herod's fortress and did something else entirely. They raided Jewish villages. The blackest of those raids was Ein Gedi, a thriving Jewish settlement in an oasis not far from Masada. And one night, during Passover of all times, the most important Jewish festival, the Sicarii came down from the hills and attacked it, not to fight an enemy, to steal food, because their supplies were running low. They struck at night. The residents, taken by surprise, had no chance. Josephus gives a number: 700 civilians killed, mostly women, children and the elderly, because the fitter men managed to run and the weaker ones didn't. 700 defenseless people killed by their own countrymen on a festival for sacks of grain. And now the punchline that leaves a genuinely bad taste. The same men who murdered 700 civilians at En Gedi are the same men the whole world will remember a few years later as the heroic defenders of Masada. The same hands. Because the fact that we know Masada today as a symbol of heroism is no accident. The fortress was excavated in the 1960s by a man named Yigael Yadin, an archaeologist, but earlier, in another life, a general, chief of staff of the Israeli army. And it was him, the former soldier, running excavations broadcast live to an entire nation, who helped build Masada into a national myth, a general who became an archaeologist and dug a legend out of the sand, whose foundation was the men of En Gedi. And one more group everyone forgets: the Samaritans. Because it isn't as if they just watched passively while the Jews and Rome fought over the region. They had their own uprisings, separate ones, for their own reasons. They hated the Jews for the destroyed temple, for centuries of contempt, but they hated Rome too. They stood in between, alone, hostile to everyone. And here we come back to Pilate to close his story, because Pilate, who provoked the Jews so many times and always somehow walked away from it, finally came unstuck on the Samaritans. A man appeared among them, whom the sources simply call a prophet, and he promised to uncover the sacred vessels supposedly hidden by Moses himself on Mount Gerizim, on that holy mountain. And an enormous crowd gathered, armed, ready to follow him up. Whether the prophet really believed in those vessels, or whether it was an attempt at revolt dressed up as religion, we don't know. But Pilate reacted the way Pilate reacted. He struck. He sent troops, broke up the assembly, killed many, and had the leaders executed. And here's the irony that closes the whole portrait of Roman rule. The Samaritans complained about Pilate to his superior, the governor of Syria. And this time the complaint worked. Pilate lost his post. He was recalled. Pilate provoked the Jews with standards. He killed people with clubs over the aqueduct. And for all of that, nothing. He kept the post for 10 years, and when Rome finally punished him, when it finally recalled a governor for going too far, it didn't do it for the Jews. It did it for the Samaritans. The only time the empire decided a prefect had overstepped concerned a people most of history forgets entirely. That tells you everything about how little an ordinary person's life was worth under the Roman boot, and which groups in this region counted for even less than the others. I have to stop now and say something necessary, because throughout this episode I keep repeating Josephus writes, according to Josephus reports. And you may be wondering by now who this Josephus even is, the man everything rests on. It's a question that has to be answered before I tell you about the war, because almost everything we know about this war comes from one man, and that man was a traitor. His name was Yosef ben Matityahu, born in Jerusalem into a priestly family, an aristocrat on both sides, educated, ambitious, well-connected. Before the war, he was already travelling to Rome and moving in circles around the imperial court. When the revolt broke out, he was given command in Galilee, meaning he was put in charge of the armed resistance across the whole north. And he ended as Flavius. As a Roman citizen, a client of the imperial Flavian dynasty, hence the name, living in a villa in Rome, on an imperial pension, writing the history of this war under the eyes of the men he had been fighting not long before. How does a man go from commander of the rebellion to trusted favourite of the emperor who crushed it? The credibility of everything we know about this war hangs on that question, and the answer is hiding in a cave beneath the town of Jotapata. Jotapata was a fortified stronghold in Galilee, and it was there that Joseph, still the rebel commander, not yet Flavius, held out against the Romans under Vespasian, who I'll get to shortly. The siege lasted 47 days. In the end, the fortress fell, and Joseph, instead of dying with a weapon in his hand, as a commander should, did something else. He hid in a deep cave, together with 40 other men, local notables who had also taken shelter there. The Romans found them because a woman who escaped gave up the hiding place. Vespasian offered surrender and guarantees of safety. Joseph wanted to surrender, but the 40 men in the cave did not. They would rather die than fall into Roman hands, and they threatened to kill anyone who tried to surrender, Joseph included. And here Joseph came up with something that entered history not just as a wartime episode, but as a mathematical problem. He proposed a pact. Since taking your own life by your own hand is a sin, let's do it differently. Let's stand in a circle, draw lots, and count round it, and every man the count lands on dies by his neighbour's hand, so that nobody has to end himself. Each dies by the hand of the man beside him, until one is left. And here's the catch, because you can calculate it. If you know how many of you there are, and which number the count falls on, then before you start, you know exactly where to stand to survive. And when only 2 men were left in the cave, Joseph and one other, the 2 of them suddenly stopped. They didn't complete the pact. Joseph talked the other man into surrendering to the Romans instead of dying. Josephus himself writes about it with disarming cynicism, that he survived, as he puts it, whether by luck or by divine providence. Not providence, mathematics. This is a real mathematical problem, known to this day as the Josephus problem, and it gets set to students in algorithms classes. And I'll tell you that while writing this episode, I sat down and worked it through myself to check it wasn't an urban legend. It works. If you know the number of people and the interval, You know in advance where to stand to survive. And it's very likely that this educated aristocrat, standing in a cave, facing death, simply did the sums. He placed himself and one obedient man in the safe positions, and he sent 39 men entrusted to his command to their deaths, dressing cold arithmetic in the language of divine judgment. Is that what happened? Honestly, we don't know for certain. It's one of 3 versions. Maybe he did calculate it. Maybe it was chance and he added the mathematics afterwards. Maybe he had an arrangement with Vespasian from the start, and the whole cave was theatre. 3 versions, none of them certain. But you know what is certain? That 39 men died, and Joseph walked out alive. And that will repeat. Joseph will always be the one who walks out alive. And here's the thing that stings most, because there was a counter-history. There was a second witness to this war. A man named Justus of Tiberias, secretary to the Jewish king, who wrote his own chronicle. And in that chronicle, Joseph is no moderate pacifist dragged into a war against his will. In Justus, Joseph is one of the chief agitators, the man who got the Galilean rebellion going, a tyrant who forced cities into resistance. Except Justus's chronicle is lost. It didn't survive. All we have are Josephus's furious replies to accusations that vanished long ago. So the one man who could have undercut Josephus's version is silent, because his words crumbled to dust. Only the traitor's voice was left. Because Joseph survived by one more method, the most brilliant of the lot. Brought before Vespasian as a prisoner, he declared himself a prophet. He told the general he'd had a revelation, that the God of Israel had decided to punish his people and transfer his favour to Rome. And that he, Vespasian, the man he was speaking to right now, was destined to become emperor shortly. A prisoner tells his captor, "You will be ruler of the world." That's either the impudence of a condemned man or a genuine prophecy. Vespasian didn't know which, so just in case, he didn't have Joseph executed. He kept him under arrest. Just in case. And now the best part, because the prophecy came true. In Rome within a single year, 3 emperors took the throne and fell off it, each of them overthrown or killed within months. And the 4th, the last, the one who finally held power and founded a new dynasty, was Vespasian. The exact Vespasian to whom Joseph had prophesied the purple, kneeling before him as a prisoner. When Vespasian actually became emperor, Joseph stopped being a prisoner. He became the man who had foretold the emperor his throne. He was freed, showered with honours, citizenship, property, a pension, and taken into the imperial family, into the Flavians. Yosef ben Matityahu, commander of the Jewish rebellion, became Josephus Flavius. The rebel commander became the darling of the dynasty that drowned that rebellion in blood. And there you have our only witness, a traitor, a genius of manipulation, a man who survived everything that should have killed him, and at the same time, the only source we have. Almost everything I'm about to tell you about the siege of Jerusalem comes from his pen. The pen of a man with every reason to lie, to defend the Romans, to clear the emperors, to justify his own betrayal. We have no choice. We listen to him, with a hand on our wallets. Chapter 5. The Fire. And now, the man who lit the fuse. You've seen the spiral of reprisals. Now the lighter. His name was Gessius Florus, Roman procurator of Judea. And he was, even by the standards of Roman governors, who were not famous for angelic kindness, exceptionally rotten. Josephus writes that his predecessor, who also stole, looked like a philanthropist next to Florus, because the predecessor stole quietly, Florus stole ostentatiously, for show, and in practice became a partner to gangs of bandits, guaranteeing them impunity in exchange for a cut of the loot. He owed the post to his wife, incidentally, who was friends with the Emperor Nero's wife. That's how you built a career back then. And Florus crossed the last line. Under the pretext of unpaid taxes, he had 17 talents of gold taken out of the temple treasury itself. 17 talents is several hundred kilos of pure gold. But it wasn't about the amount. It was about where he took it from the heart of the nation's religious identity, from the sacred treasury. And here the Jews did something that stops me every time. Instead of reaching for weapons, they started going through the streets, collecting small copper coins in baskets. For, as they put it, poor Florus. Somebody take pity on the poor, hungry procurator, who is evidently so hard up that he had to rob God. Publicly, in front of the whole city, straight-faced, they collected pennies for the most powerful man in the province. Mockery straight into the face of a power that has swords, when all you have is a basket of coppers. And it was the mockery Florus couldn't take, because you can bear a revolt. Laughter is harder. He sent troops into the wealthy quarter of Jerusalem with orders to loot and kill. Over 3,500 people died, women and children among them. And worse, Florus had a group of Jews who held Roman citizenship, men of equestrian rank, flogged and crucified. That was a flagrant breach of Roman law, which forbade such punishments of citizens without a verdict. And Josephus suggests Florus was pushing for war deliberately. He knew the aristocracy would finish him with a denunciation. He preferred a national fire to an audit. And the region exploded. The revolt broke out in earnest. The Jewish attacks on the pagan cities, the ones I described, rolled across the country. Rome had to respond. And here a man named Cestius Gallus enters, governor of Syria. He assembled a powerful army, built around the 12th legion, supported by detachments from other legions, cavalry, archers, and contingents from allied kings, some 30,000 men in all, and he marched on Jerusalem to crush the revolt, fast, as a demonstration. At first it went well for him. He reached Jerusalem itself, made camp on Mount Scopus, forced his way into the suburbs, burned the artisans' quarter, and began besieging the Temple Mount. Some of the terrified residents were ready to open the gates to him. Victory was in the air, a matter of days, maybe hours. And then Cestius Gallus did something nobody has ever been able to explain properly. For no clear reason, as Josephus has it, for no cause on earth, he ordered a retreat. He broke off the siege and started pulling his whole army back towards the coast. Why? The sources differ here. Maybe he was afraid he wouldn't take the city before winter. Maybe his siege engines were too weak. Maybe it was a deliberate show of force, rather than an attempt to capture it. Or maybe, as people whispered, somebody paid him. We don't know. And honestly, this puzzle is one of those things in history that irritates me most, because everything pointed to victory, and he simply turned around. We know what happened next. Because the retreating army had to pass through the narrow defile at Beth Horon, on the road from the coast to Jerusalem, and the Jews were waiting there. On the ridge, on the cliffs, above the Roman column trapped in the gorge. It was a slaughter. Nearly 6,000 soldiers died, infantry and cavalry together. The Romans abandoned their siege engines, which the Jews seized immediately. And something happened that, to Roman pride, was an unbearable disgrace. The rebels took a legionary eagle, the standard of the 12th legion, a sacred object whose loss was a permanent stain on the legion. And here's a beautiful, grim rhyme in history. Because that same defile, Beth Horon, is precisely the place where 200 years earlier, the Maccabean heroes, ancestors of the Hasmoneans, smashed a Greek army at the start of their own revolt. The same narrow road, the same victory against the odds. For the Jews it was like a sign from God. They had beaten a Roman legion in the exact spot where their ancestors began the road to independence. In the euphoria, they believed it could be won. And I have to be the narrator who ruins the party. Because the truth is this: they won one battle against one legion, and Rome had 28 legions at the time. That single victory wasn't the beginning of a triumph, it was a death sentence, because now Rome could no longer afford to let it go. It's worth saying something here that fits no patriotic version. The revolt was not united. There was no single nation rising as one man against an occupier. A series of local revolts, or a putsch by radicals, historians argue. Mason maintains it wasn't one uprising at all. Goodman argues the priestly elites actively took part, at least at the beginning. What's certain is that a large part of the population didn't want this war, and a Sicarius's dagger closed the debate very effectively. You see it most clearly in a scene Josephus describes in detail, the speech of Agrippa II. Who's he? The last of Herod's line who still counted for anything. A great-grandson of Herod the Builder, a king ruling part of the region, a man educated in Rome who knew the empire's power firsthand. And Agrippa stood before the crowd in Jerusalem and delivered a long, desperate speech, begging them not to go to war. He explained a simple thing: you will not beat Rome. Nobody beats Rome. Look at the world. Look at how many peoples mightier than you are lying under the Roman boot. You will die, and the city and the temple will die with you. And the crowd jeered him, rejected him. Agrippa, seeing he would convince nobody, had to flee the city. And he wasn't alone in that opposition. The Pharisees, many of them were against the war. The priestly aristocracy collaborated with Rome, not out of love, but out of a sober calculation that revolt meant national suicide. Josephus himself started out as a moderate. Plenty of people saw where this was going and tried to stop the avalanche. And here's Josephus's claim, a man with an interest in blaming the zealots, but even after discounting for propaganda. During this war, the zealots took more Jewish lives than Roman ones. And you see it best in besieged Jerusalem itself, because before the Roman legions closed the ring around the city, Jerusalem was already ruined, not by Rome, by itself. The city was split between armed factions that hated each other more than they hated the Romans. John of Gischala, a veteran from Galilee, some 6,000 men, held the temple courtyards and swallowed the smaller zealot faction of Eleazar during Passover by sending his men in disguised as pilgrims with weapons hidden under their robes. He massacred pilgrims at a festival, in the temple, to gain a patch of ground in a fight with another Jewish gang. And earlier he'd stolen the cedar beams sent by King Agrippa for the temple's expansion. He had them built into war machines. Timber meant for the house of God went into a battering ram. Simon bar Giora, the largest army, somewhere between 15 and 25,000 men, supported by Idumeans, yes, those same forcibly converted Idumeans, held the upper city. He instituted a reign of terror. He had the high priest Matthias, son of Boethus, executed, along with 3 of his sons, on a charge of favouring the Romans. Deserters had their hands cut off and were sent back. Josephus writes that Simon was more terrifying to the people than the Romans themselves. And now this picture. because it's absurd to the point of pain. 2 Jewish gangs killing each other inside the walls of Jerusalem, and outside, beneath the walls, 4 Roman legions calmly form up and wait. They simply wait. They don't have to do anything. They pitch camp, cook supper, watch the smoke rising over the city, and probably wonder whether they'll be needed at all, given how efficiently the defenders are doing their job for them. It's hard to find better proof that this revolt lost against itself before it lost against Rome. And then came the thing that may be the purest proof of this revolt's madness. The city had enormous food stores. According to rabbinic tradition, the reserves gathered by 3 wealthy benefactors could have fed Jerusalem for 21 years. 21 years of siege. The Romans would never have sat that out on hostile desert ground. And those stores burned. Whether they were burned deliberately to force the undecided residents into the fight, as rabbinic tradition says, or went up in the fighting between factions, the effect was the same. The city was left without food. The radicals, one way or the other, sentenced their own people to starve. And the hunger came. Terrible hunger. Josephus describes scenes I won't take apart here, but I'll stop at one because it deserves the slowdown. Martha, daughter of Boethus, a woman from the richest priestly family in the city, used to luxury, to the best food, to the fact that anything can be bought. And when the hunger came, she sent a servant for flour, first for white, then for dark, then for the cheapest barley, and every time the servant came back with nothing, because everything was sold out or burned. In the end, Martha threw all her gold and silver into the street. "What use is it to me now?" she said, and she walked out barefoot onto the filthy streets to look for anything to eat. And she died, because the dirt of the street clung to her bare feet, and the infection took her. The richest woman in the city, barefoot, in the mud, with useless gold abandoned behind her. That's all. There's no moral here. There's only an image that stays. And at that same time, a certain man was doing something entirely different. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the sages, one of the men who understood that all of this was heading for annihilation. He knew the zealots wouldn't let anyone out of the city alive who wanted to surrender. So he faked his own death. His students laid him in a coffin, according to tradition, with a piece of rotting meat, so the smell would fool the guards, and carried the living rabbi out beyond the walls, ostensibly to a funeral. He reached the Roman camp and Vespasian, and he didn't ask for the city to be spared. He knew the city could no longer be saved. He asked for one thing, for a small seaside town where he could open a school. He said, roughly, this: "Give me Yavne and its sages." Remember that sentence, because while the temple burned, while 2 gangs murdered each other in the rubble, while Martha died barefoot, one man thought not about walls, not about gold, not about victory. He thought about a school. And it's that school, not any of those gangs, that will turn out to matter more than anything happening outside the walls. And then the fire came. In the summer of the year 70, the Roman legions, now under Titus, Vespasian's son, because the father had become emperor and handed over command, broke the defense, and the temple went up in flames. And here is one of the biggest disputes over sources in this entire story. Did Titus want to save the temple or burn it? Josephus, our traitor, our only witness, is clear. Titus wanted to save it. He called a war council and argued against destruction. And the fire was started by a nameless soldier, against orders, in the heat of the fighting, and Titus supposedly ran there himself, trying to put it out. The temple, Josephus writes, burned against Caesar's will. Except there are other sources. The Roman historian Tacitus and the chronicler Sulpicius Severus say the opposite, that Titus wanted the temple destroyed, deliberately, to root out the Jewish religion once and for all, and the Christian religion along with it, which the Romans regarded as an offshoot. And the modern consensus among historians leans towards that second version. Because Josephus had every reason to clear Titus, that was his patron, his benefactor, the emperor's son, the man he owed his life to. Josephus cleared Titus because he had to. And there's one more argument. Titus called the council on the 9th day of the month of Av, roughly August in our calendar, exactly on the anniversary of the burning of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar. The fire broke out the next day. Rabbinic tradition will fuse those dates into one. Josephus, as an eyewitness, records them differently. The effect is the same. This doesn't look like coincidence. It looks like a choice. There's also a detail about the gold, and here I'll be straight with you, because the sources contradict each other. There's a story that when the temple burned, the gold on its walls melted and ran down into the cracks between the stones, and Roman soldiers then took the walls apart, stone by stone, to scrape that gold out. From greed, not from hatred. It sounds powerful, and one source gives it as fact. But I'll say it plainly, it isn't in Josephus himself. Josephus says only that after the war, the price of gold in Syria fell by half, because the plunder from Jerusalem flooded the market. The rest, that scene with molten gold in the cracks, is probably a later tradition, built to fit the prophecy that not one stone would be left upon another. So I'll leave it as it really is. What's certain is that the Romans stripped the temple so completely that they collapsed the price of gold across the province. The rest is a legend that sounds too good to throw away, but not good enough to trust. The plunder from Jerusalem was carried in a triumph through Rome, meaning an official victory parade, a procession through the centre of the city with the spoils, the prisoners, and the army. And there's physical proof of it that still stands. The Arch of Titus. It stands in the Roman Forum, and on its relief you can see a procession of soldiers carrying the sacred 7-branch lampstand from the temple, the menorah, and the silver trumpets, and the table. The holiest objects of the Jewish world, cut in stone as Roman loot. And today, tourists walk under that arch. They take photos. Most of them have no idea what they're looking at. And finally, Rome invented the most humiliating punishment of all, a tax. Every Jew in the entire empire, man, woman, child, had to pay 2 drachmas a year from then on, the same 2 drachmas they had been paying to their own temple. Except now the money went to rebuilding the pagan temple of Jupiter in Rome. Think about the malice in that. You keep paying the same tax as always, but now you're funding the temple of a god your religion considers an idol. Your piety turned into the instrument of your humiliation. And Simon Bar Giora, the one from the other faction, lord of the upper city, more feared than the Romans, he was led through Rome in the triumphal procession, a noose around his neck, flogged. And at the end of the procession, according to Roman custom, he was taken to the prison and killed there. It was the only execution in the entire triumph. When word of his death came, Josephus writes, the crowd erupted in joy. Let's stop for a moment, because there's a quotation that already appeared once in this series, and now it comes back. Psalm 137. Hundreds of years earlier, by the rivers of Babylon, exiles from the first destruction wept remembering Jerusalem. By a foreign canal, in the mud, under palm trees. And now again, the second destruction. The same city in ruins a second time. The same temple burned. the same people scattered. Hundreds of years between one weeping and the other, and the words are the same. There's no moving forward here. Here you come back. And there's one more thing worth adding, because it spoils the drama of the catastrophe. After the fall of Jerusalem, the region did not empty out. The temple burned, and yes, for the Jews that was the end of the world as they knew it, the end of a religion built around one sacred place. But the Jews didn't disappear. They went on living in Galilee, on the coast, in hundreds of places. The Greeks went on living in their cities. The Samaritans went on living under their mountain. The Idumeans, the Syrians, all of them stayed. The region didn't become empty. Only the center disappeared. The heart. That one place everything had turned around. And that leaves the question of what happens next to people whose temple has just been burned. How do you practice a religion that staked everything on one building when that building is ash and you're forbidden to return to the city? In a small seaside town, an old rabbi opens a school. He has no army, no walls, no temple. He has a few students, a few scrolls, and one question he has to answer before it's too late. How to be a Jew without a temple. The town is called Yavne, and what happens there will turn out to matter more than everything that has just burned. And that's where we'll end today. I hope I managed to lay this out clearly and that nobody got lost in the flood of places and names. Write in the comments whether you want the final part, because that's where I'm closing this whole series. If you'd like to say thank you, you can buy me a coffee. Link on screen and in the description. I'd also recommend joining the channel membership on YouTube. There's a lot of material there for members only, completely ad-free. Details in the description. Every week I add more videos for supporters only. If you enjoyed this, like the video and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Didn't enjoy it? Thanks for watching to the end anyway. See you next time.